A racist cop dragged a black woman into court, determined to see her locked away, not because she had committed a crime, but because of his own prejudice. The accusation was flimsy, absurd even, but that didn't matter. He had power. He had a badge. And in his mind, that was enough. The humiliation was public, deliberate, meant to break her spirit. But in a single moment, with a phone call straight from the Pentagon, everything changed. And what happened to the officer after that left everyone in the courtroom stunned. She had been on her way home, a long day behind her, her mind occupied with the kind of classified information that most people would never be privy to. A woman with clearance beyond imagination, trusted with national security secrets that could shift the balance of power. But none of that mattered when red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror. None of that mattered when she rolled down her window and saw his face, stern, full of authority, and already laced with the assumption that she did not belong. License and registration. His voice was cold, commanding, like he was daring her to question his authority. She handed over her documents without hesitation. Everything was in order. No violations. No reason to be stopped. Still, he lingered, eyes scanning her face, waiting for an excuse, searching for something to justify the stop. "Ma'am, step out of the vehicle." Confusion flickered across her face. "Why? What's the reason?" "I said step out." When she hesitated, his hand hovered near his holster. That was enough. Enough to make her exhale, make her weigh the risk. Enough to make her place her hands where he could see them before she moved. Enough to make her comply. But compliance wasn't enough. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." A sharp inhale. Disbelief flashed across her face. "I haven't done anything wrong." "You don't tell me what's wrong or right. You do as you're told." Anger. Not the kind that explodes, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that simmers. The kind that sits deep in the chest, cold and suffocating. The kind that black people know too well. That bitter, helpless anger of knowing the rules don't apply the same way for you. That logic won't save you. That dignity can be stripped away in seconds. "Tell me what I did. This is illegal." A smirk. He was enjoying this. Obstruction of justice. Disobeying an officer. "You refuse to show respect." Respect. She swallowed down the rage. She had spent years earning respect, rising through ranks, protecting the very country that was now treating her like a criminal. And yet, here she was, wrists bound in cold steel, the weight of injustice pressing down on her, suffocating her. The ride to the station was silent. She could feel his satisfaction radiating from the front seat. He had won. In his mind, this was just another example of putting someone like her in their place. He didn't need a reason. He was the reason. The courtroom was filled with whispers, eyes scanning her expensive suit, her calm posture. People were watching. Judging. Some smug, others uncomfortable, but none stepping forward. She stood there, hands cuffed, the officer standing proudly beside her, ready to tell the judge how she had been aggressive, how she had refused to comply, how he had no choice but to arrest her. "Your Honor, she was openly disrespectful and refused to follow direct orders. That is grounds for obstruction of justice." The judge frowned. "Disrespect? What exactly did she do?" "She refused to address me with the proper respect that an officer of the law is due." A heavy silence filled the room. "That's why you arrested her?" The judge's voice was laced with skepticism. "That's why." The air was thick with tension. The officer stood tall, waiting for validation. Waiting for the judge to agree that his authority had been threatened, that his actions were justified. And then the doors opened. A court officer rushed in, his expression urgent. He didn't hesitate. He moved straight to the judge, handing over a slip of paper, whispering something in a hushed, hurried tone. The judge's eyebrows lifted. His gaze flickered back to the woman standing before him. What he read changed everything. There was a shift. A barely perceptible crack in the officer's confidence. He saw the way the judge's posture straightened, the way the weight of the moment suddenly felt different. Officer Blake, step forward. Confusion flashed across his face. Excuse me. Step forward. Now. His smirk faltered. Something was wrong. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The judge placed the paper down and locked eyes with the woman before him. The woman who, just moments ago, had been treated like a criminal. The woman who had stood silent through her humiliation, through the suffocating injustice, through the whispers of strangers. Ms. Robinson, you are free to go. Effective immediately. The room erupted. The officer turned, his confusion morphing into rage. Wait, what? You can't just. Before he could finish, another officer entered. This one walked straight to him, his expression unreadable. Officer Blake, you are hereby placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. Everything stopped. The courtroom, the whispers, the energy. The color drained from his face. His mouth opened, then closed. His world was tilting, slipping from his grasp. She stood there, her cuffs removed, rolling her wrists as if shaking off the remnants of his attempt to break her. And as she turned to face him, there was no gloating. No smirk. Just the quiet, steady confidence of a woman who had survived. A woman who had seen power abused one too many times. A woman who knew that justice, slow as it might be, always had a way of making itself known. Because when the Pentagon calls, everything changes. And what happened next? That, you'll have to wait to see. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and injustice in all forms. This channel is a space where stories shed light on real issues, exposing prejudice and celebrating resilience. To every Black viewer watching, your voice, your existence, and your worth are undeniable. No system, no bias, and no act of hate can diminish that. Stay strong. Keep pushing forward. And always remember, justice has a way of finding its course. Now, enjoy this powerful story. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next twist. Let's get into it. The morning light filtered through the blinds of Keisha Robinson's penthouse apartment, casting soft streaks of gold against the sleek marble floors. She sat at the counter, sipping her black coffee, eyes scanning the classified documents spread before her. The Washington skyline stretched beyond the windows, a quiet reminder of the power she held in her hands. Keisha had spent years clawing her way to the top, navigating through a world where she was constantly underestimated, dismissed, or ignored. But here she was, one of the highest-ranking intelligence officials at the Pentagon, entrusted with national security secrets that could shift the balance of global power in an instant. She was used to moving in spaces where she was the only Black woman in the room. The only person expected to prove, again and again, that she belonged. It didn't matter how many degrees she had, how many operations she had overseen, or how many crises she had diffused, there was always someone waiting for her to make a mistake, always someone whispering that she didn't deserve to be here. But Keisha didn't waste time justifying herself anymore. She let her work speak for itself. She let her results silence the doubters. Her phone buzzed, snapping her back to reality. A message from her assistant, briefing moved to 9 a.m. General Peterson wants you in early. Keisha exhaled, running a hand through her perfectly straightened hair. Another long day ahead. Another series of high-stakes decisions that most Americans would never even know about. She closed the folder in front of her, placed it inside a secure briefcase, and stood, adjusting the tailored blazer that hugged her form. Every move was precise, controlled. She had learned long ago that the world gave her no room for error. Outside, the streets of Washington, D.C. were alive with their usual rhythm, horns blaring, pedestrians rushing, government officials in dark suits moving with purpose. Keisha slid into her black SUV, her driver nodding at her through the rearview mirror. She wasn't a woman who liked to be driven around, she preferred control, but security protocol dictated otherwise. In her position, risks were too high, threats too real. As the vehicle wove through traffic, her mind drifted. She thought about her mother, who had worked 2 jobs just to put her through school. About her father, who had been the first to tell her that no one was coming to save her, that she would have to fight for every single thing she wanted in life. And he had been right. From the moment she stepped into her first law enforcement role, she had felt the weight of doubt pressing against her. She was too young, too ambitious, too black. Yet she had risen. She had outworked, outthought, outlasted them all. But some people would never see her as anything more than what they chose to believe. Some people, no matter how much she accomplished, would always see her as less. Officer Blake was one of those people. He had been a cop for over 15 years, but unlike Keisha, he had never needed to prove his worth. The badge had given him instant authority, instant respect. He had grown up in a world where the rules bent in his favor, where his mistakes were excused as minor misjudgments while others lost everything for far less. He had patrolled these streets long enough to know exactly how much power his uniform carried, and he had no intention of letting anyone challenge that. Blake didn't like the way things were changing. He didn't like the growing scrutiny on law enforcement, the cameras, the constant questioning of tactics that had once been accepted without hesitation. He didn't like people like Keisha Robinson, people who walked into rooms they weren't supposed to belong in, people who carried themselves like they deserved to be treated as equals. So when he pulled her over that night, it wasn't about law enforcement. It wasn't about keeping the streets safe. It was about reminding her, reminding people like her, that no matter how far they climbed, they were still beneath him. He had done it before. The stops, the accusations, the thinly veiled threats. He had mastered the art of making people feel powerless while keeping just enough plausible deniability to avoid consequences. And Keisha? She had been the perfect target. A black woman in a luxury car, alone, late at night. An easy win. When she had questioned him, calmly, directly, without fear, something inside him had snapped. She didn't cower, didn't plead. She had looked him in the eye as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience, as if she were untouchable. No one was untouchable. The moment she hesitated to step out of the car, he had his excuse. The moment she pushed back, demanded a reason, he saw his opening. Obstruction. Disrespect. The words meant nothing, but they were enough. The cuffs clicked around her wrists, and for the first time that night, he felt in control again. The station had been quiet when they walked in. A few raised eyebrows, a few murmurs, but no one questioned it. A black woman in cuffs. Just another Tuesday night. The paperwork was routine, the charge vague enough to justify holding her. He expected her to sit there, to wait, to realize that no amount of education or power could save her from the reality of who she was. But Keisha Robinson wasn't just anyone. And Blake had made a mistake. He had arrested the wrong woman. By the time she stood in that courtroom, her posture was unwavering, her expression unreadable. She didn't beg, didn't plead. She let him speak, let him present his case with the same arrogance that had led him to this moment. And then, as the judge's eyes skimmed the note that had been delivered moments before, everything changed. The words on that paper weren't just words. They were orders. And when the judge spoke, when he looked at Blake, when he called him forward, when the room shifted and the ground beneath him seemed to crack, Keisha allowed herself a small, measured breath. Justice had taken its time. But now, it was here. The air inside the courtroom was thick, charged with an almost tangible tension. Every eye was locked onto Keisha Robinson as she stood there, still restrained by the weight of the cuffs around her wrists, yet exuding a quiet authority that unsettled even the most indifferent faces in the room. The judge's gaze flickered between her and Officer Blake, his face carefully controlled, but there was something there, something that indicated a shift was coming. Keisha could feel it, sense it in the way the courtroom had grown unnervingly silent, the kind of silence that meant something big was about to happen. Blake, however, was still standing tall, arms crossed over his broad chest, exuding the cocky confidence of a man who had spent his life being untouchable. His uniform was neatly pressed, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, his gun still holstered at his hip like an unspoken threat. He had done this before, brought black men and women into courtrooms with trumped-up charges, watched them crumble under the weight of a system that was never built to protect them. He expected this to be no different. He had no doubt that when this was over, he would walk out of this courtroom with his power intact, while Keisha would walk out humiliated, defeated, and with a permanent stain on her record. But something was off. The judge had received a note, one that had changed the entire atmosphere of the room. Blake had seen it too, had watched the judge's reaction, the way his expression had tightened, the way his lips had pressed into a thin line. There was hesitation now, something Blake wasn't used to seeing. Judges rarely hesitated, and it came to cases like this. It was supposed to be routine. So why did it suddenly feel like the ground was shifting beneath his feet? Keisha kept her expression unreadable, but her mind was racing. She had felt the weight of injustice before, knew what it was to be doubted, to be silenced, to be treated as if her worth was dependent on whether a man in uniform deemed her respectable enough. But she also knew power. Real power. The kind that didn't come from a gun or a badge, but from influence, from knowledge, from connections that ran deeper than most people could even comprehend. And as she stood there, she knew that Blake had made a critical mistake. The judge cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Officer Blake, step forward." Blake frowned but obeyed, his heavy boots clicking against the polished floor as he approached the bench. His posture was rigid, his confidence unwavering. He was waiting for the judge to validate him, to reaffirm his authority. "Yes, Your Honor." His voice carried that same arrogance, the belief that whatever was about to happen, it would end in his favor. The judge slid the note to the side, fixing him with an unreadable expression. "You arrested Ms. Robinson on the charge of obstruction of justice, correct?" "Correct." "You claim she was disrespectful and non-compliant." "She was, Your Honor. She refused to address me properly. She questioned my authority." The judge exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple as if trying to contain his frustration. Then, in a voice far too calm, he asked, "Tell me, Officer Blake, do you know who Ms. Robinson is?" Blake's smirk didn't falter. "She's a civilian who failed to comply with law enforcement." The judge let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. He lifted the note, tapping it against the desk before setting it down again. "No, officer. She is not just a civilian. Ms. Robinson is a senior intelligence officer at the Pentagon. Her security clearance is higher than mine, higher than yours, higher than anyone in this courtroom." A sharp murmur rippled through the room, gasps barely contained as the weight of that revelation settled over everyone. Keisha remained still, watching the reaction play out exactly as she had expected. She had been underestimated her entire life. This was no different. Blake blinked, his smirk faltering for the first time. That can't be right," he muttered, shaking his head as if trying to make sense of it. That's fact," the judge interrupted sharply. "And what's more, I just received a direct order from the Department of Defense. You see, Ms. Robinson is not just an intelligence officer. She works in high-level national security. The kind of work that, frankly, is far above any of us. And do you know what happens when someone like that is wrongfully detained?" Blake's throat bobbed as he swallowed, the confidence draining from his posture like air from a punctured balloon. The judge leaned forward, voice dropping lower, every word deliberate, seething with barely concealed anger. "People get fired. People get investigated. People," he paused, eyes locking onto Blake's, "Get removed." The word struck like a hammer, echoing through the courtroom. Blake took a step back, his breathing uneven now. His hands, the same ones that had so confidently gripped Keisha's wrists in those cold steel cuffs, clenched into fists at his sides. Keisha didn't move, didn't say a word. She didn't have to. She had already won. "Ms. Robinson," the judge continued, turning his gaze to her. "You are free to go. Effective immediately. This arrest should never have happened." Keisha exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the cuffs lifted as the bailiff hurriedly unlocked them. The room was still buzzing, the shift in energy palpable. She flexed her wrists, rolling them slightly, savoring the moment. But she wasn't done. As she turned, her eyes met Blake's, and for the first time since this all began, she saw something new in them. Fear. The kind of fear that comes when a man realizes that, for the first time in his life, he is not the one holding the power. Blake took another step back, shaking his head. This is a mistake," he whispered, but it sounded more like he was trying to convince himself rather than anyone else. Keisha adjusted her blazer, smoothed the sleeves, and then, in a voice steady and composed, she spoke the only words necessary. "You have no idea what you've done." The silence that followed was deafening. Because this wasn't over. Not even close. The air inside the courtroom had shifted completely. The once smug posture of Officer Blake had unraveled into something rigid, something bordering on desperation. He could feel the weight of the judge's words pressing down on him, suffocating, like a vice tightening around his throat. His mind raced, trying to process what had just happened, trying to grasp how, in a matter of minutes, the power dynamic had flipped. He wasn't in control anymore. He wasn't the one calling the shots. And for the first time, the realization sank in, he had made a mistake. A grave, irreversible mistake. Keisha Robinson stood before him, her expression unreadable, her posture unwavering. There was no anger in her eyes, no gloating, no satisfaction, just an unsettling calmness, the kind that comes from knowing a storm is about to hit, but having the patience to let it build first. She didn't need to say anything. The room was already speaking for her. The whispers had started, the murmurs of confusion, of realization, of something much bigger at play. The people who had initially watched her in silent judgment now glanced at each other, exchanging looks of unease. Blake clenched his jaw, swallowing back the rising panic in his chest. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had seen it 1,000 times before, a black person in cuffs, a judge who didn't care, a system that would bend in his favor no matter what. He had counted on it, relied on it. But now, the judge's gaze was sharper, colder. The courtroom officers were suddenly looking at him like he was the one on trial. The silence was broken when the judge spoke again, his voice carrying a weight that made Blake's stomach turn. "Officer Blake, your conduct has not only been called into question but is now under immediate federal investigation. Do you have any idea what that means?" Blake stiffened. His mouth opened, then closed. He knew better than to speak now, knew that any word out of his mouth could be used against him. And yet, the impulse to defend himself clawed at his throat. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I was just doing my job." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Your job? Tell me, officer, does your job include fabricating charges? Does it include abusing your power to detain an innocent woman simply because she didn't show you the deference you think you deserve?" Blake's lips pressed together into a thin line. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. He needed to take control, needed to find a way out of this spiral before it pulled him under completely. "I followed protocol," he insisted, forcing his voice to remain steady. "She was uncooperative. She refused to comply. That's obstruction." A scoff from the judge, sharp and disbelieving. "No, officer. What she did was ask a question. What you did was weaponize your authority against someone who posed absolutely no threat to you. And worse? You did it to the wrong person. Blake's stomach churned. The wrong person. He didn't know what that meant, not entirely, but the way the judge was looking at him, the way Keisha was standing there, arms now free, watching him like she was simply waiting, made the unease curl deep into his gut. Then, the doors opened. 2 men in dark suits entered the courtroom, moving with quiet precision, their faces unreadable. They walked straight toward the judge's bench, handed him another document, and stood to the side, waiting. The judge took the paper, his eyes scanning it. A slow, deliberate inhale. "Officer Blake," he said, his voice even now, measured. "I have just received confirmation from the Department of Defense that Ms. Robinson's wrongful detainment is being treated as a matter of national security interference." Blake's entire body went cold. "Excuse me." His voice came out smaller than he intended, thinner, cracking at the edges. The judge didn't even look up. "National security interference," he repeated. "Which means that what you did tonight, this arrest, this abuse of power, has now escalated beyond this courtroom, beyond this jurisdiction. This is now a federal matter." Blake took a step back. He could feel the sweat gathering at his collar, the suffocating pressure tightening around his ribs. That's ridiculous," he choked out, shaking his head. "This is being blown out of proportion." She was what? Keisha's voice, smooth and controlled, cut through the space between them. It was the first time she had spoken since being freed. The room stilled. All eyes turned to her. She stepped forward slowly, deliberately, closing the space between them inch by inch until they stood only a few feet apart. "I'd love to hear how you were about to justify this," she said, tilting her head slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "Please. Enlighten me." Blake swallowed. He could feel his own pulse hammering at his throat. Keisha took another step. "You thought you could do this," she murmured, almost thoughtful now. "Because you've done it before, haven't you? You thought no one would question it. That I would sit there quietly and take it. That by the time I got a chance to speak, it would be too late." Blake's fists clenched at his sides. You don't get to talk anymore," Keisha interrupted, her voice still calm, but carrying a weight that made his chest tighten. "You don't get to control this narrative. You don't get to stand here and act like you are anything but exactly what you've always been." The room was silent. Even the judge was simply watching now, letting this moment unfold. Keisha took another step forward, voice lowering, her words slicing clean and sharp. "You don't get to rewrite this," she said. "Not this time." Blake's breath was coming too fast now. His head was spinning. He needed out. He needed to fix this. Then, the 2 men in suits moved. They stepped forward, their presence commanding immediate attention. "Officer Blake," one of them spoke, his voice neutral, emotionless. "You are being placed on immediate administrative suspension, effective now, pending a full federal investigation." Blake froze. "No," he said, his voice hoarse. "No, you can't, you will be escorted from this courtroom," the agent continued, unfazed by his protests. "And you will be relieved of duty until further notice. Failure to comply will result in immediate detainment." Blake turned, desperate now, looking to the judge for intervention. But there was none. The judge simply watched, impassive. Then, he turned to Keisha. And she just looked at him. Not with anger. Not with hatred. With certainty. With finality. Blake's mouth opened, his chest rising, falling, but no words came. And then the men took him by the arms. And everything he thought he had built. Everything he had relied on. Everything he believed made him untouchable. Came crashing down. Blake's breath came in sharp, uneven bursts as the grip on his arms tightened. The men in suits, silent and methodical, started leading him away from the judge's bench, their movements precise, calculated. His feet felt heavy, unsteady, like the ground beneath him had turned to quicksand. He struggled against the reality crashing down on him, against the cold realization that this wasn't a dream, that there was no undoing what had just happened. This wasn't supposed to be happening. Not to him. Not like this. Wait, his voice cracked, desperate now, the confidence drained from it completely. This is wrong. I didn't do anything wrong. He turned his head, trying to catch the judge's gaze, trying to find some sliver of the power he once held, but it was gone. The judge was already stacking papers, his expression blank, like he had already moved on. Like Blake was no longer worth his attention. Keisha stood still, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression unreadable as she watched the scene unfold. There was no satisfaction in her face, no smugness, no gloating, just the steady, unwavering gaze of a woman who had already won. Blake's throat tightened. He turned his attention to her, his voice rising. You did this, he spat, his voice shaking. You set this up. Keisha tilted her head slightly, watching him with an almost clinical detachment. I set this up, she repeated, her voice calm. You mean, I planned for you to pull me over? I forced you to put me in cuffs. I made you walk into this courtroom and lie under oath. She let the silence stretch between them for a moment before shaking her head. No, Officer Blake. You did this to yourself. Blake's pulse pounded against his skull. He had always been able to talk his way out of things. Always. The department covered for him, the union backed him, the system protected him. But now, as the realization set in that there was no escape, that every move he made had led to this precise moment, panic clawed at his chest like a living thing. You're blowing this out of proportion, he tried again, voice cracking. I didn't know who you were. If I had known, Keisha's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes flickered, sharp and dangerous. If you had known, what? She asked, voice quiet. You would have treated me differently. Blake flinched. He hadn't meant to say that. The room was suffocating now, the weight of his own words pressing down on him like a heavy fog. He looked around, desperate for someone, anyone, to step in. His fellow officers weren't moving. His colleagues, the people who used to have his back, were watching with stiff postures, some avoiding his gaze entirely. The realization sank in like ice in his veins. He was alone. Keisha took a slow step toward him, her voice measured. You would have let me go if you had known who I was, right? She said. Because to you, respect isn't something you give, it's something people have to earn. And in your world, people who look like me don't start with it. We have to prove ourselves. We have to be someone before you decide whether or not we deserve dignity. Blake's mouth opened, but no words came out. How many people like me have you done this to? Keisha continued, her voice unwavering. How many times have you let your badge justify your prejudice? How many lives have you altered, knowing no one would ever question you? She let the words settle, let them cut the way they needed to. You thought you were untouchable. But the problem with people like you? You never realize how fragile your power is until it's gone. Blake yanked against the grip on his arms, frustration bubbling into something ugly. I was just doing my job, he barked, his voice raw. I was doing what I was trained to do. Keisha's expression didn't change, but the smallest shake of her head sent a sharp chill through him. No, she interrupted, her voice colder now. You were doing what you could get away with. The silence that followed was absolute. Blake's breath came in harsh gasps, his mind scrambling for an escape, but the walls had closed in. The authority he once wielded was slipping through his fingers like sand, and no amount of anger, no amount of denial, could stop it. The agent holding his left arm spoke, his voice flat and professional. Officer Blake, as per federal mandate, you will be placed on immediate leave while the investigation into your conduct is conducted. You will surrender your badge and service weapon. Any attempt to interfere with this process will result in further disciplinary action. Blake's eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat. Wait, what? You can't, Badge, the agent said, not unkindly, but with the finality of someone who wasn't going to repeat himself. Blake's hands shook as they reached for his belt. The metallic weight of his badge felt heavier than it ever had before. He stared at it for a moment, his reflection distorted in its polished surface, before his fingers loosened, letting it drop into the agent's waiting palm. Then, the gun. His fingers hovered over it for a second too long, as if clinging to the last remnant of his authority, the last tangible piece of his power. But he knew. There was no undoing this. The moment the weapon left his hands, it was over. The grip on his arms tightened again as the agents turned him toward the exit. He caught one last glance at the room, the judge now fully occupied with other cases, the officers he once called brothers watching with unreadable expressions, and Keisha Robinson standing exactly as she had before. Unmoved. Unshaken. As he was led past her, their eyes met one final time. There was no victory in hers, no pleasure in watching him fall. Just certainty. And that was worse. Because it meant she had known all along. He had already lost before he even walked into this room. As the heavy doors of the courtroom swung shut behind him, the sound echoed in his ears like the final nail in his coffin. For the first time in his life, he understood what it felt like to have everything taken away. And there was no one left to save him. The doors slammed shut behind Officer Blake, the cold air of the courthouse hallway hitting him like a punch to the gut. The weight of the badge that had just been stripped from him still lingered on his chest, a phantom sensation that made his breath shallow and his movements stiff. The hallway was emptier than he expected, the usual chatter of clerks and officers absent, leaving only the echo of his own footsteps. He had never felt small before, not like this. Not like a man walking toward the edge of a cliff with no way back. The agents on either side of him moved without urgency, yet every step felt like a march toward something irreversible. His mind raced, grasping at explanations, justifications, some kind of lifeline that could pull him back from the abyss. This couldn't be happening. Not to him. He had done what any cop would do, he had asserted control, put an arrogant woman in her place, made sure she knew who had the real power. He had done it 1,000 times before. The only difference was that this time, he had picked the wrong target. The wrong woman. And now, he was paying for it. As they reached the main exit, he saw familiar faces, officers he had worked with for years, standing near the doors. None of them spoke. None of them even nodded in acknowledgement. They just watched. Some looked away. A few whispered amongst themselves. Blake felt something twist in his gut. The camaraderie, the unspoken brotherhood, the shield that had protected him for so long, it was crumbling, slipping through his fingers like sand. He clenched his jaw, his voice coming out rough, edged with something dangerously close to panic. This isn't over. You hear me? I'll fight this. He looked at the agent on his right, searching for some flicker of doubt in his face, something that suggested this was all a misunderstanding, that it could be undone. I have rights. You can't just, the agent didn't even glance at him. You'll have your due process, Officer Blake. Just like everyone else. Blake exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. I'm not like everyone else. And that was the truth, wasn't it? He had never been treated like everyone else. He had always been on the other side of this equation, the one standing with the authority, with the power, with the benefit of the doubt. He had dictated how things played out. But now, as the doors opened and the bright midday light hit his face, he realized how quickly that power could be taken away. The world outside felt different. The air was heavier, the noise sharper. Reporters had gathered near the steps, cameras flashing, voices shouting questions that blurred together in a chaotic frenzy. How had this spread so fast? How had his fall from grace become a spectacle in mere minutes? The agents didn't stop. They moved him through the chaos with quiet efficiency, ignoring the barrage of questions, the microphones being shoved in their direction. Blake's name was on every journalist's lips, their voices slicing through the air. "Officer Blake, are you being placed under arrest? Do you have a statement regarding the wrongful detainment of Keisha Robinson? How do you respond to the allegations of racial bias and abuse of power?" Blake's head pounded. He wanted to yell, to shove past them, to regain some semblance of control, but the weight of everything, of his own mistakes, of the cameras capturing every movement, of the people who were watching him not as a figure of authority but as a disgrace, kept him frozen. And then, he saw her. Keisha Robinson stood at the bottom of the steps, her posture steady, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't hidden behind security, wasn't flanked by press teams or political figures. She stood alone, watching him the same way she had in the courtroom, calm, unshaken, in complete control. Blake's chest tightened, rage and humiliation burning through him. He hated the way she looked at him, not with satisfaction or triumph, but with something even worse, certainty. She had known this was coming. She had known from the moment he put those cuffs on her that this was how it would end. And she hadn't needed to lift a finger. She had just waited. Blake's voice was low, sharp. "You did this to me." Keisha didn't blink. "No. You did this to yourself." Blake took a step forward, but the agents tightened their grip on his arms. The message was clear, he wasn't in charge anymore. He inhaled sharply, forcing himself to regain some composure, to salvage whatever dignity he had left. "Enjoy it while it lasts," he muttered, his voice laced with bitterness. "Because one day, people like me will be back in control." Keisha's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was something stronger. "People like you," she repeated, her voice as steady as ever. "People like you have been in control for a long time. But you made a mistake, Officer Blake." She tilted her head slightly, the weight of her words sinking into him like lead. "You assumed no one was watching." Blake's breath caught. "You assumed you could do whatever you wanted, and there wouldn't be consequences," she continued. "But the world is different now. And people are tired. People are paying attention. And when people see, really see, what's happening, what's always been happening, there's no going back." Blake's fingers curled into fists, his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to argue, to lash out, to deny it. But what could he say? What could he possibly say that would erase what he had done? The reporters surged forward again, cameras clicking, microphones raised. The questions came faster now, their voices overlapping. "Keisha Robinson, do you have a statement? What are your thoughts on Officer Blake's suspension? Do you believe justice has been served?" Keisha didn't turn to them. She didn't raise her voice or adjust her posture for the cameras. She kept her gaze locked onto Blake, her next words cutting through the noise with ease. "Justice," she echoed softly. "This isn't justice. This is just a start." Blake's stomach twisted. This wasn't over. Not for him. Not for her. And not for the world watching. The voices of the reporters blurred into a chaotic hum, their flashing cameras a relentless staccato of light cutting through the tense atmosphere. The weight of their questions hung in the air, each one demanding answers, demanding accountability. But Keisha Robinson remained still, composed, her expression unwavering as she watched Blake being pulled further into the storm he had created. There was no need for her to answer those questions. The truth was already out in the open for the world to see. Blake's breathing was shallow, erratic. He was still processing the full weight of what had happened, the irreversible collapse of the world he had once controlled. Every instinct screamed at him to fight back, to push against the walls closing in on him, but there was nowhere to turn. He had seen people lose everything before. He had watched men be stripped of their power, dragged from their careers, their reputations shattered in an instant. He had never once thought he would be one of them. His voice, when it came, was raw, edged with something that almost sounded like desperation. "You don't get it," he muttered, his gaze fixed on Keisha, his once unshakable confidence fraying at the edges. "You think this changes something? You think this means you won?" Keisha didn't react. She didn't need to. Blake's frustration twisted into something sharp. "The system protects people like me," he pressed, his voice low but forceful, grasping for the certainty that had always been there before. "It always has. You think one hearing, one bad headline, is gonna change that? You think I won't be back?" Keisha finally blinked, her eyes scanning his face, as if assessing just how deep his delusion ran. Then she exhaled, slow and deliberate. "You still don't understand, do you?" Her voice was quiet, yet it cut through the noise with ease. "This was never about whether you come back. It was about making sure people like you never get to operate in the shadows again." Blake's jaw tensed, his fingers twitching at his sides. He hated the way she looked at him, like she had already calculated every possible outcome and still found him insignificant. He wanted her to be angry, wanted her to lash out, to give him something to push against. But there was nothing. Just that unbearable, suffocating certainty. "You're naive," he spat, shaking his head. "People like me don't go away. We adapt. The headlines fade, the outrage dies down, and the world moves on. You really think anyone's gonna remember this in a year?" Keisha didn't flinch. "Maybe they won't," she admitted, tilting her head slightly. "Maybe they'll forget your name. Maybe in time, they won't even remember your face. But what they won't forget, what they can't forget, is what they saw." Blake swallowed, but the dryness in his throat made it feel like glass scraping against his skin. Keisha took a step closer, lowering her voice just enough that only he could hear. "They saw you," she murmured. "They saw what you did. They saw what people like you do. And once people see, really see, it's impossible to go back." Blake wanted to argue, to throw her words back at her, to find some flaw in her logic that he could cling to, but nothing came. Because deep down, buried beneath the resentment and denial, he knew she was right. For years, he had counted on the silence. He had relied on the fact that people looked away, that they excused, that they justified. But that silence was breaking now. And in its place, there was a spotlight. Keisha didn't need to say another word. She had already said everything that mattered. She turned, stepping past him, moving through the crowd with the same grace and composure that she had walked into that courtroom with. The press swarmed toward her, questions flying, but she didn't rush, didn't falter. She let them speak, let the cameras capture everything, knowing full well that the story was already out of her hands. Blake was still standing there, frozen in place, as the agents guided him toward the waiting vehicle. The walk felt longer than it should have, the stairs heavier, the whispers louder. He kept his gaze forward, refusing to acknowledge the faces watching him. He didn't need to see their expressions to know what they were thinking. He had been the one looking down on people his entire life. Now, the world was looking down on him. The agents opened the door, gesturing for him to step inside. His hands shook as he climbed in, the car door slamming shut behind him. The moment the noise of the outside world was cut off, the silence in the car became deafening. He closed his eyes, inhaling sharply, but there was no escape from the weight pressing down on him. For the first time in his life, Blake wasn't in control. And he had no idea what came next. The car ride was suffocating. Blake sat rigid in the back seat, his shoulders tense, his hands pressed against his knees as if grounding himself to reality would somehow change it. The agents in the front were silent, their focus fixed ahead, unmoved by the storm raging inside him. The city blurred past the window, but Blake barely saw it. His mind was too loud, too restless, too consumed with the weight of what had just happened. His badge was gone. His gun was gone. The career he had built on authority, on control, on the unshakable certainty that he belonged, all of it had crumbled in an instant. He had spent years patrolling these streets, walking through this city like he owned it. But now, as the car moved deeper into Washington, he realized how different the world looked from the other side of the glass. He clenched his fists. He needed to fight this. He needed to get ahead of the narrative before it swallowed him whole. He had connections, people who owed him favors, people who could make things disappear. He just needed time. He just needed to think. But the agents weren't taking him back to the precinct. They weren't giving him time. Blake shifted in his seat, his voice sharp. "Where are you taking me?" The agent in the passenger seat didn't look back. "You'll be briefed when we arrive." Blake's jaw tightened. "This is ridiculous. I'm not under arrest." No response. A slow, simmering frustration coiled in his chest. He wasn't used to being ignored. He wasn't used to being handled. He inhaled sharply, trying to steady himself. "I have rights. If this is an investigation, I want my union rep, the agent in the driver's seat spoke for the first time, his voice even, emotionless. "Your department has already distanced itself from you. Your union is waiting to see how this plays out before they decide whether you're worth protecting. Right now, you're on your own." Blake's stomach lurched. On his own. That thought had never crossed his mind before. He had always been insulated, protected, part of a system that shielded its own. He had spent his career watching accusations against officers get buried under bureaucratic red tape, seeing bad press swept away before it could stick. But now, he was the headline. He was the one being cast aside. His throat was dry, but his voice was steady when he spoke again. "This is political." No answer. Blake exhaled sharply, forcing himself to sit back. "It's a damn witch hunt," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "They want a scapegoat. That's what this is." Still, silence. His jaw clenched. "I know how this works," he continued, his voice growing sharper. "The media takes one incident, spins it into something bigger, and suddenly everyone's out for blood. They want to make an example out of me. But guess what? I'm not the first, and I won't be the last. The public will forget. They always do." This time, the agent in the passenger seat turned his head slightly, just enough that Blake could see his profile. "That's what you're counting on, isn't it?" Blake frowned. "You think time will erase this," the agent continued, his voice calm, measured. "That people will get distracted, move on. That the system will bend back in your favor. Maybe it will." He turned fully now, locking eyes with Blake in the rearview mirror. "But that doesn't change what's happening right now, does it?" Blake held his gaze, something twisting deep in his gut. He had built his life on the assumption that men like him didn't fall. Not permanently. The system had cracks, sure, but it always corrected itself. It always found a way to protect those who enforced the rules, no matter how flawed they were. But something about the way the agent was looking at him sent a chill down his spine. "Tell me something," the agent continued. "Do you even understand why this is happening to you?" Blake scoffed, leaning back. "Because some suit at the Pentagon made a call." The agent studied him for a long moment, then shook his head. "No. Because for the first time, you did this to someone who could fight back." The words hit harder than Blake expected. The agent turned away, focusing back on the road. "If you had done this to anyone else, it would have been another report buried in paperwork. Another statistic that never saw the light of day. But you picked her." Blake swallowed hard, a cold weight settling in his chest. Keisha Robinson. He didn't even remember her name when he arrested her. She had been just another person he could silence, another face that didn't matter. He hadn't seen her as a person. Just an obstacle. An inconvenience. And that was the problem, wasn't it? He had spent years treating people that way. And now, for the first time, he was the one being treated like he didn't matter. The car slowed as they pulled up to a government building, the windows tinted, the entrance heavily secured. Blake's pulse quickened. This wasn't standard procedure. The agents stepped out first, waiting as Blake hesitated for a fraction of a second before following. The moment he stepped onto the pavement, the doors ahead opened, and standing in the dimly lit lobby was her. Keisha Robinson. Her posture was relaxed, her expression neutral, but there was something in her gaze that made Blake's stomach twist. She wasn't surprised to see him. She wasn't caught off guard. She had known he would end up here. Blake's fingers curled at his sides as he forced himself to meet her eyes. "You really think this is over?" His voice was low, sharp. Keisha didn't blink. "No," she said simply. "I think this is just the beginning." The weight of those words settled between them, heavy and undeniable. And for the first time since this all began, Blake finally understood, this wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger. And there was no going back. Blake sat in the cold, windowless room, his hands resting on the steel table before him. The air was thick with silence, the kind that stretched, that made time feel distorted. The chair beneath him was uncomfortable, stiff, but he barely noticed. His mind was too busy replaying everything that had led him here. His badge was gone. His career, destroyed. His name, now synonymous with disgrace. He had spent years walking into rooms with power, with respect, with an untouchable certainty. But now, he was just another man sitting on the wrong side of a table, waiting for someone else to decide his fate. The door opened, and Keisha stepped in. She moved with the same controlled precision as always, her presence commanding without effort. She sat down across from him, placing a folder onto the table, the sound echoing in the empty room. She didn't rush. She didn't fill the silence. She let it sit between them, let it settle, let him feel it. Blake clenched his jaw, unwilling to break first, unwilling to give her the satisfaction of seeing how much this was unraveling him. Keisha finally spoke, her voice calm, even. "Your department has cut ties with you completely. The union won't fight for you. You're under federal investigation for civil rights violations and misconduct. There will be hearings, trials, and consequences. This isn't just about your career anymore. This is about who you are." Blake exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I did my job," he muttered, his voice raw, hollow. "I did what I was trained to do." Keisha leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "No," she said, her voice steady. "You did what you thought you could get away with." Blake's fists clenched against the table, but there was no fire behind it anymore. Just exhaustion. Just the slow, creeping realization that there was nothing left to fight for. His world had collapsed, and no amount of denial was going to rebuild it. Keisha let the silence stretch again before she continued. "You want to know the difference between us?" she asked. "You spent your entire career controlling people, making them afraid, making them feel powerless. You thought authority meant domination. But real power? It doesn't come from fear. It comes from respect. From accountability. From the fact that when you walked into that courtroom, the world saw you for exactly what you are." She sat back, crossing her arms. "And they won't forget." Blake looked away, his throat tight. He wanted to argue. He wanted to defend himself. But the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, he knew she was right. He had lived in a world that protected men like him. A world that let him walk away from mistakes, from cruelty, from abuse of power. But not this time. This time, he had been seen. And now, there was no escaping it. Keisha watched him for a long moment before standing. "Your story is over," she said simply. "Mine is just beginning." She turned, walking toward the door, and for the first time, Blake felt it. The finality. The truth that had been looming over him since the moment he put those cuffs on her. He wasn't coming back from this. The door closed behind her, leaving him alone with his regrets. Outside, Keisha stepped into the hallway, inhaling deeply. The weight of the past few days, the months, the years of being underestimated, of being dismissed, of fighting battles that shouldn't have needed fighting, settled in her chest. But there was no exhaustion in it. No defeat. Just clarity. She had always known the rules were different for people like her. She had always known she would have to work twice as hard, fight twice as fiercely, just to be seen as equal. But today, she had proven something undeniable, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, who had ever been made to feel powerless. Justice wasn't perfect. It was slow. It was flawed. But sometimes, when the right people refused to back down, when the truth refused to be buried, it found a way. She stepped outside, the crisp air hitting her skin, the city alive around her. The cameras were still there, waiting. The world was still watching. And she would make sure they kept watching. Because the fight wasn't over. It was just getting started. Now, let's talk about this. How many times have stories like this happened in silence? How many people have been wrongfully accused, stripped of their dignity, their lives forever changed, all because of a system designed to protect power instead of people? Keisha Robinson fought back because she had the resources, the connections, the position to do so. But what about those who don't? What about the voices that never get heard? The truth is, power unchecked is power abused. And silence allows it to thrive. But when people pay attention, when they hold the system accountable, when they refuse to look away, change happens. So what do you think? Was justice truly served? Or was this just one small victory in a much larger fight? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And before you go, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Because the truth is, the most unexpected twists. They happen in real life. And we'll be here to tell them. Until next time.